The deadline passed at 11:59 p.m. on a Tuesday. No statement from Ottawa, no emergency press conference, no diplomatic communication through back channels, no social media post, no indication from any Canadian government official at any level that the expiration of the most aggressive American ultimatum issued to an allied nation in the modern era was being treated as an event requiring public acknowledgement at all. Washington had given Canada 72 hours to comply with three specific demands, or face consequences described in the ultimatum's language as severe, immediate, and unprecedented in the history of American trade enforcement against any partner nation. Canada let the deadline pass the way you let a storm pass when you are inside a house you built to survive storms. Without going outside to argue with the rain, I want to sit with that image for a moment before we go into the details of what the ultimatum contained and what its expiration without a word from Canada means for where this confrontation goes next. There is a specific kind of power that comes from not needing to respond. Not the power of ignoring. Ignoring is a performance of indifference that still acknowledges what is being ignored. What Canada demonstrated last Tuesday night is something different. Something that requires more than indifference to produce. It requires having built something that the ultimatum cannot reach. The deadline passed at 11:59 p.m., and Canada did not respond because Canada had already built every response 18 months ago and embedded it in institutional frameworks that operate on their own timelines, regardless of what any American ultimatum demands or when any American deadline expires. The ultimatum was issued into a silence that was not chosen in the moment. It was constructed over the course of a year and a half of the most deliberate sovereign infrastructure building any democratic nation has undertaken in response to external pressure in the modern era. The ultimatum itself was issued through a joint statement from the White House, the Treasury Department, and the Department of Defense at 11:47 a.m. last Saturday. The involvement of the Department of Defense in a trade ultimatum document was unprecedented in the bilateral relationship's history. Every previous American escalation in this confrontation had been issued through trade or economic policy channels. Defense involvement was a deliberate signal that the administration was reframing the confrontation from a trade dispute into a national security matter, and that the consequences attached to non-compliance would operate across both domains simultaneously. The ultimatum contained three demands. Canada would suspend all retaliatory trade measures within 48 hours. Canada would provide written assurance of supply continuity for all critical resources currently flowing to American buyers, including energy, minerals, agricultural products, and timber. And Canada would agree to enter a structured bilateral negotiation framework within 72 hours on terms the administration would specify following Canadian acceptance of the first two demands. Read those three demands in sequence, and the negotiating logic becomes clear. The first demand removes Canada's economic leverage before any negotiation begins. The second demand removes Canada's supply leverage before any negotiation begins. The third demand then initiates negotiations in which Canada has surrendered both forms of leverage as preconditions for sitting down. It was the same structural approach every previous American demand in this confrontation had used. Disarm first, negotiate later. On our terms, with the weapons we specified, on the timeline we set. Canada had refused every previous version of this structure since the confrontation began. The administration apparently calculated that the escalation level attached to this ultimatum was high enough, and the deadline tight enough, that the refusal pattern would break, that somewhere between 48 hours and 72 hours of facing consequences described as severe and unprecedented, Canada would calculate that the cost of continued refusal exceeded the cost of accepting the framework. Canada let the deadline pass without a word. The 72-hour window that preceded the deadline expiration was the most closely monitored period of this confrontation by diplomatic correspondents, financial market participants, and allied government officials since the declaration of total economic war 18 months earlier. The monitoring produced something that trade analysts have described as the clearest single data point this confrontation has generated about the actual state of Canadian institutional resilience relative to American pressure capacity. The monitoring produced nothing. Canadian government officials continued their scheduled activities. Cabinet meetings proceeded on their normal schedule. Parliamentary business continued without emergency sessions. No special economic measures were announced. No emergency communications with allied partners were reported. No Bank of Canada interventions were activated. No sovereign wealth fund movements were triggered. The 72 hours passed with the specific quality of institutional calm that is only possible when the deadline being watched does not correspond to any actual operational vulnerability in the institution it is targeting. The consequences the administration had attached to non-compliance were announced the following morning. They were real consequences. New tariff measures on additional Canadian product categories, raising the cumulative tariff burden on Canadian exports to American markets. Financial sector measures restricting specific categories of Canadian institutional access to American capital markets. And a formal downgrade of the bilateral trade relationship status in American trade law from allied partner to enhanced scrutiny jurisdiction, a category that triggers additional regulatory requirements for all Canadian goods and services crossing the American border. The consequences landed. They created real costs for real Canadian businesses and real Canadian workers. The administration had not been bluffing about implementing them. What the administration had been wrong about was the relationship between the consequences and the outcome they were designed to produce. The consequences were designed to create enough acute economic pain that the political pressure on Carney to seek relief would exceed the political pressure on Carney to maintain the institutional position his government had been building. That calculation required the consequences to reach economic vulnerabilities that Canada's institutional construction had not yet addressed. 18 months of construction had addressed most of them. The energy that could not be redirected from American buyers had been contractually committed to Asian and European buyers, whose long-term agreements provided the revenue certainty that made American market disruption absorbable. The minerals that could not be diverted from American supply chains had been locked into allied nation processing agreements whose timelines were already running. The payment flows that could not survive American financial sector restrictions had been rerouted through the cross-border gateway that had been operational for months. The agricultural exports that faced American market restrictions had been redirected through the supply agreements Canada had built with Middle Eastern, African, and Asian buyers. The consequences landed on a Canada that had systematically reduced its vulnerability to each category of consequence over the preceding year and a half. They hurt. They did not produce the response. The administration's public communication in the hours after the deadline expiration reflected the specific difficulty of managing the gap between consequences that had been promised and consequences that had not produced their intended effect. The White House statement described Canada's failure to respond as defiance and promised additional measures. The statement did not specify what additional measures were under consideration. The Trade Representative's Office released a technical document describing the enhanced scrutiny jurisdiction designation and its regulatory implications. The Department of Defense released a statement about the national security dimensions of Canadian resource supply chains that read more like a policy analysis than a pressure communication. None of the three communications from three different agencies produced a coherent single message about what came next, because none of the three agencies had a coherent single answer to that question. The ultimatum had expired. The consequences had been implemented. The silence from Ottawa had continued, and the administration's communication reflected the institutional uncertainty of people who had prepared for several possible Canadian responses and had not adequately prepared for the specific response they received, which was no response at all. The financial markets processed the deadline expiration and the consequences announcement with a precision that reflected 18 months of accumulated understanding of how this confrontation operates. The Canadian dollar rose on the deadline expiration day. It should not have risen. An ultimatum's expiration with consequences attached is not normally a positive event for the currency of the country receiving the consequences. It rose because the market participants who tracked this confrontation understood what Canada's non-response revealed about the actual institutional balance of the confrontation. Canada was not desperate enough for relief from American pressure to accept the framework the ultimatum had offered. That is a statement about Canada's institutional resilience that markets had been pricing gradually for 19 weeks of consecutive Canadian dollar strengthening. The deadline expiration without a word made the pricing explicit rather than gradual. American equity indices that carry North American trade exposure fell modestly as investors processed the same information. The American manufacturing sector stocks that had been pricing in a probability of bilateral resolution following the ultimatum's pressure reprice that probability downward. The agricultural commodity indices that reflect Canadian market access conditions for American farm exports adjusted for a longer timeline of restricted access. The bond market moved slightly as investors calculated the fiscal implications of a trade confrontation that would continue generating tariff revenue and retaliatory costs simultaneously on a longer timeline than the ultimatum's 72 hours had suggested would be the case. Inside the administration, the post-ultimatum analysis produced the kind of internal disagreement that characterizes institutions confronting evidence that contradicts their operating model. Officials who had been most confident in the bluff calling framework and the ultimatum as its definitive test faced the most acute adjustment requirement. The evidence was not ambiguous. The test had been run. The response had been silence. The institutional conclusion that silence supports is the one that the sovereign infrastructure arguments have been making for months. Canada's positions are not performance, they are construction. And construction does not respond to ultimatums because construction does not need to. It continues operating on its own timeline, according to its own architectural logic, regardless of what is demanded of it and when. The Allied governments that had been monitoring the ultimatum period provided their own assessment through the specific diplomatic mechanism of saying nothing immediately and everything gradually. None of the 14 members of the Democratic Nations Economic Sovereignty Alliance issued statements during the 72-hour window. None of them issued statements on the morning after the deadline expired. They waited. Then, over the course of the following 48 hours, statements emerged from 7 of the 14 members, describing the enhanced scrutiny jurisdiction designation as a measure inconsistent with the foundational principles of Allied democratic trade relationships. The statements were not coordinated in their timing. They were coordinated in their content. They cited the same principles. They used compatible language. They reflected governments that had discussed what they would say before the ultimatum expired, and had deployed their statements at the pace that diplomatic calibration, rather than crisis improvisation, produces. The Allied response was not the emergency mobilization of a coalition reacting to a surprise. It was the scheduled communication of governments whose preparations had preceded the event they were responding to. What the ultimatum's expiration without a word from Canada tells us about where this confrontation goes next is the most important question anyone monitoring it is trying to answer. The ultimatum represented the administration's most comprehensive single deployment of combined pressure tools in the confrontation's history: trade measures, financial sector restrictions, national security framing, Defense Department involvement, unprecedented consequence language, 72-hour deadline. All of it designed to produce a response that the 72 hours confirmed was not coming on those terms. The administration has a limited set of options, and none of them are comfortable. Escalating further requires identifying vulnerabilities that the comprehensive institutional construction has not already addressed. And the comprehensive institutional construction has been running for 18 months, specifically to address every vulnerability the escalation pattern was likely to target. Maintaining the current pressure level without escalating or de-escalating produces the compounding institutional divergence that each passing month deepens as Canada's alternative relationships mature, and American pressure capacity relative to Canadian absorption capacity continues trending in Canada's favor. Seeking genuine resolution requires approaching Canada as a sovereign equal whose institutional positions are structural rather than performative, and whose participation in any stabilization framework will require terms that reflect that structural reality, rather than the asymmetric terms every previous demand and ultimatum has sought to impose. 72 hours, 3 demands, 1 deadline, 0 words from Ottawa. The ultimatum was issued into a silence that had been under construction for 18 months. It expired into the same silence. And the specific quality of that silence is the quality of something that was built rather than performed. You cannot call into a house that was built before the phone existed. You cannot pressure a position that was constructed rather than chosen. And you cannot call a bluff that has been replaced by infrastructure. The deadline passed at 11:59 p.m. Canada never said a word, because the house was built. The rain had passed, and there was nothing outside worth going to the door for. If you are not subscribed, please subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. This confrontation is approaching the moment where silence stops being a position and starts being a permanent answer. You need to be here when that moment arrives. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next one.